Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Capitol Hill briefing on the front lines, principles leading through the pandemic. The panel was organized by the National Association of Elementary School Principals, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and the American Federation of School Administrators. It's part of a month of activities celebrating National Principals Month and highlighting the work of school leaders across the country. You can learn more about National Principals Month by visiting www.principalsmonth.org, and you can follow today's panel there. Remember, if you're watching this discussion, you can also join in by using the chat function, send us your questions and share comments. And of course, you can follow all of this on Twitter. Use the hashtag #ThankAPrincipal. So I want to say thank you to the principals who are joining us here today. We have 3 of them, and we have Eric Rowe. He is the principal of Prep Academy in Denver and the president of the Denver School Leaders Association. We also have Paul Wenger, principal of Jordan Creek Elementary School in West Des Moines in Iowa, and he is also the president of the National Association of Elementary School Principals. And we have Greg Boshorowitz. Did I get that right, Greg? I'm sorry if I didn't. He's the principal of Arrowhead Union High School in Heartland in Wisconsin, and he is the president of the National Association of Secondary School Principals. Thank you all for joining us today. The discussion is going to be about 45 minutes or so, and we'll leave some time for questions. So please, again, follow us on Twitter and use the hashtag and use the chat function in the comments. So why don't we start off? Eric, why don't you start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your school.
Eric Rowe again, principal of Prep Academy. I go by principal, also equity designer. We are a 6th through 12th grade competency-based school where we focus on personalized learning and project-based learning for our students. How am I doing? Better, trying to maintain a balance between work and life and still dealing with the impact of the pandemic and trying to take care of the building, students, and our team. And not just walking that talk of like, oh, self-care, but actually making time for self-care, right? So just, yeah, we are fine here in Denver.
Thank you, Eric. Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and your school.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Wenger. I'm an elementary principal in West Des Moines, Iowa, Jordan Creek Elementary. It's a school consisting of pre-K through 6th grade students. My enrollment is roughly 750 students. I've been there for 6 years. And before that, I was a principal in a rural school in Iowa for 15 years with an average attendance of about 325 students. So I have kind of the rural plus the urban settings, both experiences, and high Title I in my first school, and then a little bit lower free and reduced lunch average in my current school. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. And Greg?
I'm the principal of Arrowhead High School. It's a suburban /rural school just outside of between Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin. And we have about 2,100 students. Again, I've been there for 28 years in that capacity, so it's been a long time. I've seen a lot of changes over those 28 years. And our school is a comprehensive school. We have students who fit all the gamuts. And we've had a tough last year, a little bit better this year. But that's what we hope to talk about today. And it's been a good run, and we're looking forward to having these conversations.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm really listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about what it's like leading schools right now. And so before we delve into all of that, I just want to ask you, just how are you doing? As a reporter, I've written about this and I've read about this. There's just so much about educators, whether it's teachers or superintendents and principals, bearing the brunt of the anger and frustration from communities that are kind of just tired with COVID-19 mandates and restrictions. And you're dealing with all of that in a new environment. So how are you? How are you doing? Paul, do you want to take a stab at it?
Sure. I'm kind of in a unique position. I think Greg is kind of also currently NASP has purchased, I'm on a sabbatical from my school because I'm traveling for NASP, but I did touch base with the person that is filling in for me right now. And I can talk a little bit about, what things we had to deal with in the past, 18 months. I would say probably the biggest challenge that we've had to deal with is some of the things the changes that are out of our control, such as at the beginning of the school year, the governor in Iowa said that we cannot mandate masks. And so that was, and previously all last year we had masks mandated, and except for the last 2 weeks when this law came into play. And now then that was challenged. And so that's now the school district is requiring our students and adults to be wearing masks. And so that's hard for some of the parents to understand. And so I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have faced. It's really not hard for the kids. The kids are really good with the masks. And I think it's been very helpful in the health of not only the kids, but also of our staff.
Eric?
I would say just looking at Denver public schools, the city did issue a vaccine mandate from the mayor's office. We do, as DPS's policy has issued masking mandates. We are masked and in school and in person. We have high vaccination rates among DPS employees. So if comparing it to when we went into COVID break or emergency instruction and then coming back with no vaccine, the stress is much less than it was then. Because our first job is like, how do we keep everybody safe and create a welcoming learning environment? And there was no really way to do that when COVID first hit. I think about schedule changes and all of that. So I think the vaccine has helped. The fact that high numbers of DPS staff have vaccinations and of our students who are eligible to receive the vaccine, I think that number is at 75%. Don't quote me on that, but it is high. So that's given some comfort to folk. But I think the other thing is we're still learning how to be community, because we have not been a community for a year and a half. Students have not been in school really for a year and a half. So we're having to reconnect and find one another again. And that places a premium really on social emotional learning. It's placed a premium on connecting academics for sure, but I think relationships first, right? So I want to put that out. So there is a sense of security from the vaccine and the mandates, but also we've got to learn how to be a community again.
Greg, you're not in school this year, but what are you hearing from school leaders about how they do it?
I have a little bit of a different perspective, because for the audience, one of the things that I'm doing in my role as president is I'm visiting all 50 states, and I'm doing school tours in all 50 states. So this morning I was in Vermont, and right now I'm in a school in New Hampshire. Just got done with my school visit, met with a principal, and so I can speak to from their perspective. I will say across the board, every school that I've been to, they are struggling with substitute teachers right now. And it's gotten to the point, to be honest with you, I was in a school in Brattleboro, Vermont this morning, and they didn't have anybody. So I said, hey, I'll go take the room for now. I can forego my tour for a half hour until you can find someone to come in there. And they said, no, we'll take care of it. But they were scrambling. I was in a school in Massachusetts, and what they're doing there is they just don't have subs. And so when the teachers aren't coming, they're just putting the kids in study halls. So there was one, it's a big school, large school, and there was one study hall that had like 100 kids in it. These were like 4 classes that they could not find a sub for, so they just give them study hall, and they're getting no instruction during that time. That's a huge concern, because without having subs there to go through the lesson plan, at least help those kids, get the basics of what they were supposed to get that day, they're falling further and further behind. And so that's something that needs to be addressed from their perspective. Other than that, I would say that last year was a little bit more stressful on teachers. Teaching a dual mode was very was very difficult. And we're not doing that this year. Most schools are not. They're saying, you can follow along through Google Classroom or through Canvas, whatever your school is using, but we're not going to have a teacher teaching two different modes. It's just too much of a burden on them. So that has really relieved some teachers. As a matter of fact, some of my conversations where teachers had come to the principal and said, if we're teaching in a dual mode this year, I'm quitting. At the very beginning of the school year, that was how stressful that was. So I would say right now, that's, as I see it in my travels, that's what I'm seeing as the biggest concern right now.
Right. Thank you for sharing that, Greg. And we're going to talk about staffing later, because staffing is one of the many things that principals now have to juggle that they didn't have to, let's say in 2019. And so I'm also just curious about what are the duties, roles, and responsibilities have changed because of the pandemic, and how are you shouldering them? What kind of resources are you getting to assist with the additional duties that you have?
I think hearing from members of Denver School Leaders Association, principals and assistant principals, we have folk who may not have a nurse in their building. They may not have a teacher wanting to step up to be sort of a health aide. So typically admin takes on those roles, and that brings some liability issues into play, right? We're not even just talking about a COVID case or an outbreak. It could be an allergic reaction or responding to a medical situation or emergency. We're having to shift. There are some principals in our membership who are talking about having to hold down classrooms, teaching a secondary history class, as Greg talked about, and they may be in a middle school math class, because there is a shortage of subs. And at this point, thinking about the stresses of the job anyway, of leading and 50, 60-hour weeks, and leading and trying to take care of yourself, and could you hold down a couple classrooms, be nursed for the week, be the substitute teacher, all the things add up, and it's not really sustainable. So there are folk feeling the impacts of those shortages of nurses, of subs, of teachers in some cases, not being able to be in building to support students. It takes a toll.
I guess I would piggyback on what Eric said. Last week I was in Washington, D.C. and visiting with our National Distinguished Principals, and from all across the United States. And it's not just getting substitutes, it's just filling positions from day one, from the first day of school. We still have a lot of principals in schools that have openings that aren't filled. And then on top of that, then you have substitute problem, the inability of getting substitutes, and not just for teachers. We're also dealing with the inability of getting substitutes for our associates, custodians. I mean, it's the school bus drivers. I mean, I forget which state out east, but they were going to have the National Guard drive the school buses. I mean, it's just that crazy how short we are, and it just compounds it. And then you talk about sometimes you run into contractual problems because of asking a teacher, or having them come in, and it's not, you might have to pay them extra. Well, they may choose not to do that. So it's just there's a huge number of problems that can occur because of the shortage of subs and associate subs also.
What are some of the long-term solutions that you see? Because some of it is because teachers may not be able to come to school because of quarantine rules or illness. But some of it is because someone can say to you, I can make more at a fast food restaurant and it's less, I may have job conditions that are less stressful than a school environment. What do you say to a teacher or a sub or someone, a custodian, who says I can make more at, Burger King or something? What are the long-term solutions you see for this?
Well, that's a great question, and if we can come up with the answer here, we will solve it. What I consider to be one of the biggest problems facing our country, 5, 10, 15 years down the road is a shortage of teachers. Let's kind of piggyback on and then go to your question. One of the districts that I was at had indicated to me in Mississippi that one of the larger districts in Mississippi, I won't name which one, but they had over 250 teaching positions unfilled this fall. So what are we going to do? We have to make this profession more attractive to young people and to just people across the board. And how do we do that? I think in my conversations with students, this is only anecdotal, so I can't say that I've got research to back this up. But the two reasons why kids tell me that they aren't interested in going into teaching is, one, it's too hard. They see their teachers and how many, taking bags of work home, and then they see their parents coming home from their engineering jobs, and they don't have any work to do at home, but the teachers do. And then it's the lack of respect for the profession. It's why do I want to go into a profession that gets beat up constantly, that every parent, every community member thinks they know how to do it best because they were once a student in a school. And so we need to start to change the narrative about what's happening in schools. I've been doing these school visits. I've done 12 of them over the last 3 weeks. And there are some incredible things going on. In every one of these schools, there are just awesome things going on. But we are not doing a great job of telling that story. We don't always have the resources to tell that story. How do we get that information out we can get it out to our parents, but how do we get it out to the general public in our communities about all the great things that are happening? Because once we start to do that, people start going, oh, okay, I didn't understand. Because quite frankly, it's like school is like an iceberg, right? What the parents see is the tip of the iceberg that's outside. All that stuff that happens underneath that they never see, that goes on to make that happen, is what we do to have a successful school, to have a successful classroom, and they don't see that. We need to do a better job of showing those results, so that the community starts going, wow, I really want to be a partner with these folks. We need to do something to help these schools.
To add to Greg's point too, like there is a case, and it's also coming up in the chat. So fair wages, right? Collective voice, and real professional learning opportunities, like for growth. I think it is, as we think about education as a field, like the question really should be, what's the cost to really educate a child from early childhood, say through college, from after graduating through college? What resources will we need? How can we retain and attract particularly more educators of color to stay in the field? And younger folk to come in? Like, yes, we all love children, and we come in and we get in this profession. It's a calling, right? I spent some time in a Jesuit middle school in St. Louis, shout out Loyola Academy, and the Jesuits view this as a calling, right? And so we're in it for the right reasons and purpose and passion, but a lot of time that's not really reciprocated. That's not the experience of most educators when we get into these systems. So we need to really think through, like, how do we really retain folk, treat them as professionals, and give them a path for growth? Because the idea of just, well, we're going to stick people in and you're going to be in this one space and you're going to do 30 years and after that you retire and then we'll just get somebody else in to replace you. Well, that's not even the reality. I don't think it's ever been. And so some real serious attention needs to get paid around what's the cost of educating a child from early childhood through? What type of supports are needed? How do we increase pay for educators across the board and leaders and teachers? And then what type of environment in terms of the organizations we sit in, public school, charter school, whatever it is, but how is that a learning organization? How are we growing people professionally? For whatever their next step or path is going to be. And those questions often don't get considered. Just if you think about the money part of this, the funds that have come from the federal government down to the states and to the individual districts have been helpful and have shown up in some very tangible ways, whether it's ventilation, whether it's PPE. But if we think about, not every school has a nurse. Not every school has a social worker. And even though some of those funds were directed to that, it's not enough to fund someone long term. It's a stopgap. So if you go recruit a nurse or a social worker to come into a school because there's real need for those positions right now, you're asking someone, hey, we have enough money for a year, but we're not sure if we're going to pick you up for the following year. Well, as an individual, you're going to make a different choice, right? So I think we need to be very intentional around what supports do our children need, and how do we financially support those folk for those positions that we need?
Greg, you look like you wanted to add something to that, did you?
No, I had added the first part, so no.
Okay, all right, thank you. So Eric mentioned this, and I think this was something we planned on getting to later about increasing support for students, whether it's through counselors, teaching more SEL techniques, and how you're using your COVID money, COVID relief funds around that. And yes, there's a tension as to, whether you hire someone for 2 or 3 years because you have that long-term cost, but the need is there right now. So how are you responding to students' SEL needs and mental health needs?
Let me jump in because I haven't, again, I'm getting to see all these great schools, and it's been a wonderful experience. But one of the schools that I went to down in Rhode Island, and this is something that they started doing prior to, because they've seen, as a middle school, and they've seen the mental health issues happening even before COVID. So they have really decided to put a lot of their personnel resources into that support. So they've increased class sizes a little bit in order to have money to pay for more counselors. So this middle school has 1,000 students in it. They have 4 counselors. They have 2 social workers and 1 psychologist. So they have 7 people working together, and they have a program that they put in place that costs a little money as well to train them on how to do this. And they really own those kids. They follow those kids. So I had those kids for 3 years. So one counselor has the same kids for 3 years. And then, so they break it up. So, and then they split up the students between the social workers as well. So principal says, when I have an issue with one of the students, I don't go to the teacher and talk to the teacher about it. I go talk to the counselor, because the counselors know those kids really well. They spend a lot of time with it. Now, my school, I have a high school, and I have 3 counselors and 1 psychologist I have 2 buildings, 1,100 kids. So I have 4 people for 1,100 kids. They have 7 people for 1,100 kids. That's what we need to find, is how can we hire more people in those positions so they can wrap themselves around those kids that need it, and they can identify it. If you're really short-staffed, you're not going to know when kids are having these issues. When you have enough staff, when you have enough staff where the ratio of student to that professional is a little bit smaller, they get to know them, they understand them, they can see when they're having a bad day. That's what needs to happen so that we can support those kids and make them, take care of those emotional needs, so that we can do the education piece that we need to. Because if they have those emotional needs, the education stuff just they don't get it. It doesn't sink in, because they have issues that are so severe that they don't have time they can't absorb what's being taught.
Eric, how are you responding in your school to students' SEL needs and their mental health needs during the pandemic?
Well, that has always been our focus. I mean, equity is at the core of what we do, but we deal with students who have been marginalized. Their lived experiences really are on the margin. So as I thought about coming into this year, I thought about how do we build up some routines and habits and really prioritize where our adults were and where our students were. So 7:30 to 8:30, just to give an example, I gave my team some options before we got into the work during pre-service. So they could choose from yoga, they could choose from doing robotics, they could do community service, they could do games and team building in the park with our PE teacher. I needed to ease them back into some normal habits, routines of being in the building and at work. But this is what I mean about prioritizing time. It's one thing to get up in front of folk and say, you better have work-life balance and take care. But if I don't come on the other end and really prioritize that time, right, for them, then it's just empty words, right? And so that's what thinking about social emotional needs first could look like. Not the only way, but a way. So 8:30 to 9, they sort of got themselves together, and we would start our PD from 9 to 11 and gave more time for them to plan and think through. We followed that same sort of process and schedule with our students. So we didn't start out with testing. We didn't start out with this idea of, there was all this learning loss and students are so far behind, so we need to assess them and see where they are. I'm going to use our former superintendent Cordova's words. We have not had realistic testing for about 2 years now. She called it garbage data, right? So at this point, how can we put human values first over standardized assessment data? How can we take care of the people, and students in particular first, about their social and emotional needs, their trauma? Doesn't mean it's the only thing that we focus on, but we have an opportunity really to think about doing school a different way. And it was funny that before COVID, we never had time to really focus on SEL. Now, as we're in this pandemic, vaccine now with the pandemic, folk are trying to find ways to really prioritize that time and support people, because you have to do that. If you don't, you're going to see some of the same situations that you saw before. Disproportionate outcomes and discipline. Folk leaving the profession out of stress and frustration and not being supported. Kids tuning out of school and becoming disengaged because their needs aren't being met and they're not connecting school to their future. So we have to start there. So really being intentional about implementing personalized learning. It's a way, not the only way, but a way. We're a very small school. We do have a full-time social worker, a full-time school psych, and a full-time nurse. So I think being very intentional about how you support the people in your community has to be the key. Tests aren't going anywhere, so I'm not up here advocating down with tests. I'm just saying that's not the main thing right now.
Nisa, I think the word relationship, or the term relationship building, is more crucial now than it has been ever before. And I think in the past, our first priority was probably, okay, we got the kids here. Let's start teaching and making them learn, and then we can assess them. And we've done a 180, I guess you would say, in that we have to develop the relationships with those kids first. And we spend a lot of time, a lot of elementary schools spend a lot of time the first 2-3 weeks. Academics will come. Yes, we've missed out some, the last 18 months, but you know what? If we don't have a connection with those kids, it doesn't matter how much time we have or don't have. They're not going to be focused, and they're not going to learn near as well. And I'm guessing Greg would agree at the same level at the high school. They have to know that somebody cares. And so it's so important those first 2 or 3 weeks of school that they know that, hey, my teacher cares for me. They greet me at the door every morning and say, hi, Jim, hi, Bobby, whatever their name happens to be. We're a Leader in Me school. We're a lighthouse school. And, that's been a huge plus for us. The kids, I like to say that our kids own our school because they take pride in the school. They want jobs. They want leadership opportunities. And when they know that they have those and they know that they're trusted, I think it's huge in their eagerness to learn, because, they know that my teacher's going to back me. And if I mess up or I make a mistake, it's not a big deal. It's learning, and I'm going to do better the next time. And I think when kids have that feeling, and we spend time up front, that's huge. But we have to spend the time up front to develop those relationships. And it's the same way for us as principals. We have to develop relationships with our other principals so we know who to go to get some help when we're down in the dumps, or, so things aren't going well, or, parents are blasting us. So we can, I can call Greg and say, Greg, what should I do? And he can say, well, here, try this. And you have to have that support. And the kids are no different. They have to have that support from the teachers and all the adults in the building, not just their homeroom teacher, the secretary, the custodians, the bus drivers, everybody. When there's, we all know there's a lot of problems on buses, and they have to have that relationship with the bus driver too. So all of those are so crucial.
Paul, I'm so glad you mentioned the teachers and the adults in the system. And principals. We often don't talk about principals' social emotional well-being, but we know that adults have to be well to take care of students. So I'm curious as to whether your districts are doing anything different to support you, whether it's counseling, mental health, and just how are you taking care of yourself with, this job that has changed and the additional responsibilities that you have?
I guess I'll hit it first. I think probably the biggest thing was I wanted my teachers to know that, we're in uncharted waters, and you're going to be having to try different things, do things that you've never done before. And if you fail, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, at least you're trying, and you're going to realize what you did wrong, and we're going to fix it. And I think if our staff knows that we're supporting them and know that they're not going to be, called on something that they didn't do correctly, that we're here to learn it and we're going to get better at it. I think that's one of the best things that, that we can do for our staff to support them. And like I said, it's the relationship building. Our staff is going to be much more willing to try new things if they know that we, as principals, have their backside and we'll support them.
I would concur with Paul. I think we talk about connecting with students. We also have to connect with our teachers, and that's really important. We got to get around the building. We got to talk to them. We got to get in their classrooms. You know, how's it going in the morning, before school, after school, those types of situations, because they just want to be supported. And I think a lot of times they just want to be heard. Last year, we were having problems with kids choosing to go virtual for reasons that were probably not great. You know, they're going on vacation in 2 weeks. They didn't want to get sick before they went on vacation, so they would go. And we were having in and out. Kids would come in and then they would go back out, and they'd come in, and the teachers were having to juggle these situations, and it was very troublesome. And I would just let them come in and just, you know, kind of talk about it. Let them kind of open up and have their ears open and just listen to them. Because that's what they needed. They didn't want me to solve the problem. They just wanted to kind of get it out and get it off their chest. Because I said, there's not much I can do about it. I can't determine who's doing it for legitimate reasons and who's doing it for unlegitimate reasons. So we're going to allow them to do it. But I was that sounding board for them, just to you know, let them talk and get their frustrations out. So I think that's a big one. I think the other part is that you have to agree 100%. You have to let them know it's okay to fail, that we're not expecting perfection here. I had some of my teachers who were staying up until midnight answering emails from kids, and they were getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and answering emails from kids. And I said, no, you have the right to say, I'm done at 6 o'clock at night, and I'm not going to answer any emails until 6 o'clock the next morning. And give them the ability to do that, because it was just getting crazy. I mean, my teachers were coming into my office and crying in my office because of this. And so I just gave them, you know, the green light to say no to those kids. You have a personal life as well. Part of it is they care so much. They want these kids to be successful. They were doing that, but then the kids were somewhat taking advantage of it. So really, no, give them the ability to say no, and tell them it's okay to say no. I think sometimes if they hear it from us, then they're more comfortable with it. And so I guess that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, and I think we're back in a lot of places in the country in person. I think there's still a sense of we want to get back to normal. And I think we just need to have an honest conversation that what was normal before COVID wasn't necessarily healthy or effective. The fact that working a 50 to 60 hour week was normalized. The fact that, as Greg said, you're answering emails, staying up all night planning, and then getting up and answering emails again in the morning, that's not normal. But we normalize that as a profession, that the stress and all the things that come with being an educator were normal. We normalize inequities, particularly for students of color, particularly for students with IEPs, particularly for multi-language learners, right? We have a moment and an opportunity here. There was a crisis, but there's also an opportunity for us to stop and reflect and think through how can we do this differently and better, that is sustainable, that is equitable for all, and not to go back to normal. As much as many of us may want to get to that, how do we create a new normal, like as I said, that is equitable for all of us and sustainable for all of us? And it starts with relationships first.
Eric, I just wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, quoting your former superintendent, talking about the assessment data being sort of unreliable from what we've had over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And I'm curious as to sort of just what are you using to see what your kids learn, or where the gaps might be, and how you're addressing that?
I think it is,
because there's just so much about learning loss, and I'm just curious about how you do it.
Yeah, I would say this, that, you know, when I was in the classroom, and I always had this moment when my principal would come in, of feeling like, okay, I'm about to get scored again. And I would spend, even after getting the feedback conversation, and they were great, but the score stuck with me. Whatever that number was stuck with me, right? I want you to think about students who we have distilled down to a number on a standardized assessment and what that feeling is like. It runs counter to the language we use around whole child, or culturally responsive education and equity and our and human values, right? So I would say this, that like what we've done here is say, are there some other ways to holistically really assess where students are? And I'm stealing a little bit from Alcine Mumby with Envision Learning Partners. She talked about that word assessment. The etymology of it really means to sit beside. So why would we continue to design assessments that are so far removed from the experiences and what students really know and can do on a multiple choice test? But you can do an empathy interview. You can talk to folks about what their experiences are. What should schools sound like, feel like, look like? What supports what adults and students need in order to thrive professionally and personally, right? What are your passions? What motivates you? So I would say that is some data that we don't really get into, right? But now would be a very opportune time to stop and pause and say, who do we want to be as a school community? How can we prioritize people over assessment data? So I think for us, those are some of the ways we've done this at Prep. People are trying to now look at, if the data from the past year and a half is not necessarily reliable or accurate and not every student tested, what are some other ways of knowing, of knowledge that we can prioritize over test scores? And it's so quantitative and qualitative, right? And so I think those are some things that we should be exploring and not go back to like, well, let's just find a score and then we're going to do a pre-test and we're going to do a progress monitoring check in the middle and then we're going to do a post-test. And I would say that, like, what is that really telling you about who that student is? And if you think about teacher evaluations or leader evaluations, what do those ratings really tell you about who this person is in front of you and their worth and their value and the expertise that they bring? So
Paul and Greg,
yeah,
sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry about that. I just also wanted to get some input from Paul and Greg and just what the pandemic experience taught you about how we measure and assess student proficiency and competency, and what changes can you see going forward about just how we think about measuring student learning and growth?
Sorry about that. I can jump in on that. So, to be honest, I have been very much an opponent to all of the standardized testing anyway, because I don't know that it tells us a whole lot. It doesn't tell us who's going to be successful. It doesn't tell us who's got what competencies. And it's a one-day measurement and on that given time, so it's really not very reliable data to make any decisions with anyway. But what's going to happen, I fear that the legislators are still going to push, we need to do these standardized tests. So my fear is that we're going to go right back to where we were, because those that control our purse strings are going to tell us that's what they want. So from my perspective, I think there are authentic types of assessments that you can do, and parents don't really care how their kids are doing on the math assessment, but they want them to have life skills, right? They want them to be able to interact with somebody. They want them to be able to get a job and hold a job and those types of things, and have a career and be able to be successful in wherever they go, whether it's going to be to a technical school, to a college, to into the workforce, into the military, whatever. That's what they want, and that, quite frankly, math scores do not correlate well, or English scores correlate well to how successful one's going to be once they leave the formalized schooling. So I worry that we're going to continue to do it because we're being told to, without having provide really any data that's beneficial to us, informing us as to what we need to do differently or better to help these kids be more successful. So that's what I think is really going to happen. I think we're going to go right back to where we were. We may have had, the ability to waive that over these last couple of years, but we're going to go right back to that, because I don't think the problem that we have, quite frankly, is that the people who are making policy nobody in this room is sitting down helping them make policy. So they're not practitioners; they're politicians, and that's who, and their staff members who are not sitting at the desk in the thick of things. That's what we need to have happen. We need to have people like that are sitting here helping with those policies helping make those policies, sitting at the table when they're discussing those policies, so that the people who are actually making them are informed properly, not by, well, this school district needs to have, they're worried about their scores, so we need to make them do more testing so they get their scores up. No, put people who are principals at those tables so that those making those decisions they have the proper information.
I guess I would add on to what Greg was saying is in that standardized test is one picture at a very small amount of time during the school year. And if you really want to find out how your kids are doing, you ask the teacher. The teacher knows those kids. They know if student Bobby or Susie, they don't know their blends, or they get right down to the specifics of what those kids need. And here again, it comes back to the relationships. They have those strong relationships. They know their kids, and that's where I kind of what Greg was saying. I think we need to have more of that. The standardized testing isn't telling us that. It's just a number. And when we can do that, that's when we can really help kids, when we know them personally and specific items that they are struggling with, whether it's math or whether it's reading, whatever. Because we get a score of 55 or 75 or whatever for a school, that doesn't tell us what they need. That's just a number. And so we really have to have good communication relationships with our teachers and the teachers with the kids. And so we can identify their individual needs that we need to work on.
Thank you guys so much for this. We have about 15 minutes or so left, and I had just a couple of questions before we move to audience. And I just also this is again around principal voices and you letting others know what priorities you need in schools. And I'm just also curious as to the kind of flexibility that you have with the COVID relief funds that schools have been getting. Are you able to spend those funds in the way that you think they should be spent at your schools? Like, what are you using them for?
I can speak to last year, and basically what we did is we used them to pay our subs, because we had an exorbitant sub fees or that we had to pay out. What we were doing, we had about 5 of our teachers who were vulnerable, who had medical issues. They were teaching from home, and then we had a sub in their classroom who was monitoring the students, because we have to have somebody there. Well, that's like double cost, right? We're paying the teacher and we're paying the sub to do the same job, basically. So we quickly just wiped through our sub budget. So that's really what we used mostly for, was just to subsidize that budget, because we had just wiped it all out through those having those extra teachers available.
Some of the money that we received, we put toward therapists, outside mental health services, art therapy, right? We do have a full-time nurse specifically at Prep, but I know that other schools have used that money to try to get at least part-time nurses in. That's a tall ask, right? If there were subs available, for sure, some money could go to that. But I think largely it's coming back to, like, what are the mental health supports and SEL supports for staff and students. And that's largely where, at least at Prep, we have placed many of those dollars coming from the federal government. Facility needs, yes, ventilation and the like, but for like here at Prep in our school, a lot of it's just been based on mental and social emotional supports.
Are you worried about future funding to address these concerns?
Yeah, the money was helpful, right? But I'm gonna say again, what do we prioritize? What's important to us? Test scores or people? Right. So where could other dollars be allocated where there's real need, and the need has always been there. So my concern is if policymakers, as Greg said, are making some decisions. Here's the choice. Do we want to support the well-being and the whole child of students and the educators who support those students? Or do we want to support the standardized testing industry? I mean, it's a simple choice, right? I mean, but that question's really got to be put to some folk around what's really the priority?
Okay. Before we go to the audience question, we don't want to have this be about what went wrong and how challenging it was, because it was, and we know that. But I'm pretty sure there are some things that you learned and there are some things that went right. And I'm just curious about what you learned through this experience that you hope will stay with you and stay with school systems long after the pandemic.
Let me address that, because that's one of the things I talked to every one of these principals that I've been at. I've had this conversation with them, and every one of them has had something that they are going to keep that helped them, that they were not doing prior to, but was forced to do something and went, hey, there's another way to skin this cat. And it can be something as simple as their drop off and pickup routines at their school, the way their buses, they switched it for COVID, and it's like, wow, this works much better. We're going to keep this. Okay, so that's one. In talking, like in my school in particular, there were teachers who were reluctant to embrace some of the technology that others were utilizing. So, for instance, the Canvas is a tool that we use to support our teachers and keep track of all of our data and keep track of testing and things of that nature. And teachers can put their lesson plans on there. They can put tests in there. They can put quizzes in there. So many of our teachers had embraced it, and it was going great. Others were very reluctant. It's not the way I did it. It's not Google Classroom, which I'm used to using it. Well, they had to get forced to, and they realized, wow, this is actually very helpful for us. So I think those, probably every school is going to have 2 or 3 things that they want. I'll give you one that I think all schools should consider. We went to where we had one day every 2 weeks was a virtual day. So kids worked from home, teachers put their lessons on virtually, but it was a chance for teachers to, and kids who were struggling could come in and get extra help. Kids who were virtual could come in and get extra help. And we found that we could deliver that one lesson if we were preparing for it, we knew it was coming, we could deliver a pretty impactful lesson once every 2 weeks that worked. And now that gave some collaborative time for our teachers. It gave students that extra day to just get caught up on what they need to get caught up on. And I'm hoping that other schools around the country look at that and say, that's something we should incorporate. We can deliver that lesson if we plan for it, make an effective lesson, but it also gives us some collaborative time, some opportunities to connect with the rest of our staff and with students who need extra help.
I think from the secondary level, I think the idea, given that education or learning was interrupted or disrupted from COVID, and we were online and sometimes in person and sometimes both, I think this idea of seat time, that the longer you're in a seat in a classroom in front of a teacher, or the idea that the only valuable learning happened in the classroom with the 4 walls, I think we have to, that myth, we not carry that into what we do going forward. Many of our students who are secondary students were taking care of younger siblings, meaning that parents could not afford daycare. They could not have anybody to watch their kids. So the older siblings were there making breakfast, make sure their younger siblings got onto laptops and were attending school as they got on to school. Or the reverse, where someone in the household may have lost a job and those students went to work to support families and contribute. No one can tell me that there was not some really important learning happening in those moments and situations. And so the idea that the only valuable learning happens inside 4 walls of a school, we need to do away with that, because it's just not the truth. The thing that we sort of go this alone and it's a meritocracy and you attend school every day and get good grades and you'll be fine, we need to kill that myth too. It is about community, it is about support, it's about exposing our students to mentors and building their social capital, particularly for students who have not had access to those opportunities, those people, those supports and resources. So I think we need to kill some of our sacred cows and these myths that we've been operating on forever in education and take the moment now to say, how can we do this better? Put students first. What's more important than that? What's more important than having a student leave feeling successful, having skills, having connections, and able to make their own way into adulthood? And I'm going to say again, a test score is not measuring any of that.
I think Greg read some of my notes when he started answering the question. One of the biggest pluses in West Des Moines, the junior high and high school was using Canvas, and the elementaries were a little reluctant because they felt that's not really for us. They had different things that they were doing. Well, it forced us to go to one platform, and the veteran teachers, sometimes they're a little reluctant to trying new things. And, they were forced to try new things, and they found, hey, I can do this. And, that was just a huge feather in their cap because, they tried it. It was successful. And that's something that, like Greg said, now we have teachers that think it's the best thing ever. And, and they're using it much, much more. Also, we always had a problem with our pickup at the end of the day. Parents come and they park and they get out and they talk and block traffic and things like that. Well, the pandemic, we didn't let them get out of their cars. It forced them. They realized that it was more important and they knew that they had to stay in their cars. Well, pickup just went so much better, and we tweaked a couple other things. So that was another thing that we won't change. We'll leave it the way it is because it's working so well. But those are just a couple examples, and I think the biggest thing is people know that they can try new things and they can be successful and it can be beneficial. It can be the new norm instead of the old norm.
So glad to hear that there are both small and big things that you're hoping would stick after we're done with this experience. So just wanted to just flip to the questions right now. We have one from Lauren who wanted to know, given the challenges and the reality of your current role, the changes and additional duties that you have, whether that's had any impact on labor contracts.
I would say from my perspective, no, in that we don't really have a union in Wisconsin anymore. But from our perspective, we've tried to be very cautious about overburdening our teachers. So we've not done, we try to protect them. I'll give you an example. We've always in the past, we've had our teachers had to do one semester of a supervision where they do a study hall or a lunchroom duty or something of that nature. We took that away last year, knowing that we were going to utilize them to have to sub some classes. So because we're going to have to utilize them in that capacity, we did not give them that assignment ahead of time. Well, we ended up probably the average teacher we used, maybe they had to do sub maybe 5 times. So they, instead of having 90 days of supervision, they had 5 days of subbing for somebody else. So we were trying to be as proactive as we could so that they would not have that burden put on them, the extra burden put on them.
I don't know, it wasn't COVID related, but DSLA formed a year ago. And so at that point, principals, we as leaders, we did not have a salary table. It was sort of negotiated individually. There were certain rights and protections that were not present before that. And so our platform really was around equity, given that there was a number of leaders of color who had been either forced out or pushed out in DPS over time. There was not really fair and equitable treatment. If you were a female leader, you were sometimes paid as less as $10,000 to $20,000 than your male counterparts, even though you may have more or the same experience as your counterpart. So fair and equitable treatment, collective voice, and equity were our platform. So we formed and were recognized by the board, and thank you to them, and ASA during the pandemic at its height. And so now comes the hard part of sort of implementing that contract, that agreement, right? So I think it is collaborative in nature. So I wouldn't call it contentious at all, but it's that hard work of trust and building relationship and doing the job given the shifts that we've had to make as school leaders.
I think Denisa might have frozen.
Yes.
Denisa, I'm getting called in from the bullpen here, so if Denisa, if you hop on, let me know. But I think we've got just a couple of minutes left, and so truly about 4 minutes. So if for the final just sort of question here, just real quick, I think any advice that you would sort of have to anyone listening, policymakers, anyone else, in terms of what you all need to be able to do your job here in the coming weeks and months and years?
Yeah, I'll jump in. One of the, I think what you heard from this panel right here from the policymakers is incorporate us, reach out to us. There's not a principal that I talk to in my travels that wouldn't love, would embrace the opportunity to have a conversation with you, to talk to you about what's happening and help you, have a perspective on what policy could be very impactful for schools. So please reach out to them. My campaign this year, what I'm talking about when I go out to schools is I talk about connecting. How can you connect? How can you connect with your students? How can you connect with your staff? How can you connect with your community, your legislators? So that's what it's all about, connecting with other principals, connecting with with their communities. So whatever you can do to help that, to make that happen, I would love for every principal in the country to have my opportunity, because I am learning so many great things as I'm seeing them, as I'm going to all these schools. It's been an incredible experience. I'm going to be sharing that with all the people, but having those opportunities, providing resources to go and see other schools, see what other people are doing, could hugely impact what's happening in our schools. So that would be a suggestion that I would have.
Thank you guys for keeping it going while my internet dropped. I apologize for that. It looks like we have a question about this work that the Ed Redesign team at Harvard is doing around children's cabinets. Are you guys familiar with it? And what do you think of that concept? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of shaking of heads.
No, I don't know about that work, but I think about redesign, or I'll throw one out, liberatory design, right? Like, this is an opportune moment for folks to start thinking through how do we bring in voice of students, of parents, community, all stakeholders, to really either think about what this new normal is going to be for us. Okay. Right? Every community is different, so avoid one size fits all, because we've been doing that forever, and think about what really do we need in community, what are the assets we already have in place, and how do we come together collectively to create whatever this outcome or product is going to be.
Thank you. Yeah, so, the work is around this collaboration with all the stakeholders who are part of children's life and developing a plan for them to help them succeed. So Eric's kind of like, okay.
That's the right work.
So it looks like we are at the end, and I want to thank the three of you so much for spending the afternoon and sharing what it's like to work as a principal at this time, the downside, the upside, the optimism that you have about the future. Thank you so much for that. My apologies for just, my internet dropping for a couple of minutes, but thank you for keeping it going while I was gone. Thanks for everyone who joined us on this panel. I really hope it was helpful. And you can continue to follow the activities of National Principals Month by following principalsmonth.org and following the hashtag on Twitter, ThankAPrincipal. Thank you so much.